There's a reason why certain photographs make historians uncomfortable. Images from the great industrial exhibitions of the 19th century, events that supposedly celebrated humanity's technological progress, contain details that don't belong, architectural elements that serve no obvious purpose, structures that look like churches but house machines, lighting systems that work without visible power sources, and perhaps most disturbing of all, a systematic campaign to erase these images from public access while preserving endless reams of text documents and statistical reports. What you're about to discover isn't just another conspiracy theory about lost technology. It's a pattern of evidence suggesting that, barely a century ago, humanity possessed the ability to extract electricity directly from the atmosphere, to power entire cities without burning fuel, without wires, without meters. And then, almost overnight, this capability vanished. The buildings were demolished, the knowledge was suppressed, and we were given a new history, one where progress moves in a straight line from primitive torch to inefficient light bulb, with no room for technologies that could make us energy independent. The story begins in Paris, but it will take us across continents, from the frozen reaches of the Russian Far East to the commercial heart of the empire, revealing a global network of energy technology that was systematically destroyed for reasons that become chillingly clear when you follow the money. Throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th, industrial exhibitions were held with remarkable regularity in countries around the world. The Russian Empire was no exception. These massive events showcased the highest levels of technical and cultural achievement, drawing millions of visitors and representing the pinnacle of human innovation. But then something extraordinary happened. In Russia, these exhibitions continued right up until 1917, after which they abruptly ceased for what official history calls obvious reasons, the revolution and subsequent chaos. But here's what should trouble you. In other countries, on other continents, under completely different political systems, this same tradition was interrupted almost simultaneously, with only slight delays. France, Britain, the United States, all stopped holding these grand expositions around the same time. This synchronicity suggests something far more coordinated than independent national decisions. There are implicit cause and effect links here, pointing to the global nature of these changes, to a deliberate shutdown rather than natural evolution. Given the scale of these events, covering Europe, both Americas, Asia, and Africa, you'd expect an incredible amount of visual documentation to survive. Photographs, blueprints, detailed technical drawings. Yet when researchers try to delve deeper into this subject, they encounter something strange. In Russian archives, photo catalogs of these events are practically non-existent in the public domain. What you'll find instead are digitized text reports and dry statistics in enormous quantities. Lists of participants, medal winners, statistical summaries, numbers and words, but almost no images. Foreign archives appear slightly better stocked, and it's there that unique materials occasionally surface, including photographs of Russian exhibitions. Think about how peculiar this is. To see what Russian technological achievements looked like in the late 19th century, you have to search the Library of Congress in the United States or the National Archives of France. This isn't accidental loss through the chaos of war or revolution. This is selective preservation. Text can be rewritten, numbers adjusted, context altered, but a photograph of a complex device with an operating principle that contradicts modern understanding becomes dangerous evidence. One gets the impression that a certain filter was applied. Abstract information was preserved while images capable of conveying technological details were systematically removed. To understand what was being hidden, we need to turn to the center of the exhibition world during that period, Paris. The Universal Expositions held in the French capital set the tone for global development, and participation in them was considered mandatory for any nation wishing to remain at the forefront of progress. The main venue was the monumental palace of the Champ de Mars. Today, this building does not exist, which for preservation-obsessed Europe is an extremely strange fact. Such structures are usually guarded jealously, converted into museums, protected as architectural heritage. Yet this palace was completely demolished, leaving not even its foundations behind. But before we examine what was lost, we need to look at what survived, at least temporarily. The Eiffel Tower, that iconic symbol of Paris that millions of tourists photograph every year. We think we know this structure, But look at historical images from 1900 and you'll see something very different from the tower that stands today. In archival photographs, the Eiffel Tower appears festooned with elements that no longer exist. Spherical objects are fixed to its load-bearing parts, objects whose purpose is never explained in official histories. The structure is adorned with a massive arched cornice featuring electric lamps. And if you examine this cornice closely, you'll notice something crucial. Between the decorative arches stand specific vertical pillars, elements that serve no obvious structural purpose. Now, here's where it gets interesting. These same pillars, identical in form and size, appear on the roof of the now-vanished Palace of the Champ de Mars. They're lined up in strict geometric rows across the palace rooftop. Such an exact correspondence between two different structures cannot be coincidence or mere architectural whimsy. This points to a unified technical standard, to two buildings designed as components of a single system. The official story tells us the Eiffel Tower was built as a temporary entrance arch for the 1889 exposition and was nearly demolished afterward. But this designation as entrance arch should be understood far more broadly than just a decorative gateway. The tower and the palace formed an integrated engineering network. The tower likely functioned as a giant antenna, a receiver or transmitter interacting with equipment installed on the palace roof. They were nodes in a circuit, a symbiotic system where each element was necessary for the whole to function. And this explains what happened next. When the exhibition ended and the decision was made to dismantle the Palace of the Champ de Mars, that unified circuit was broken. The disappearance of one key component made the functional equipment on the tower itself useless. The complex arched cornice with its lamps and mysterious pillars no longer served any technical purpose. So, in subsequent reconstructions, these elements were removed. Simplified decorations appeared in their place, mimicking the former shapes but completely devoid of internal function. What tourists see today is essentially a deactivated device. The casing remains, but the technology has been stripped out. The tower's survival is presented as a happy accident, preservation of an iconic structure. But perhaps it was allowed to remain precisely because it had been rendered harmless, converted from a functioning machine into an empty monument. The demolition of the Palace of the Champ de Mars looks like intentional destruction of evidence. If we assume those pillars on the palace roof and on the tower were elements of wireless energy transmission or generation, then it becomes clear why they were removed so hastily once the need for public demonstration had passed. The technology worked on principles that today might seem like science fiction, but for the engineers of that era, they were obviously functional reality. But if the tower was a transmitter or resonator, where was the heart of the system? Where was the main power node generating the energy that lit those lamps without visible wires? The answer leads us to another grand structure of that exposition, one that suffered an even more complete erasure from history. We're talking about the legendary Palace of Machines. Among the architectural masterpieces that vanished into convenient forgetfulness, the Palace of Machines occupies a special place. This colossal structure was the heart of the Paris exhibitions, a true triumph of engineering, where the most advanced achievements of world mechanical engineering were concentrated under one roof. Yet despite its uniqueness and the enormous cost of construction, the palace was completely demolished. For pragmatic, preservation-minded Europe, such wastefulness, the destruction of a fully functional, majestic building, seems absurd unless there was something about this structure that needed to be hidden. When you analyze surviving photographs of the Palace of Machines complex, you notice something in the background. A tall structure that official descriptions usually classify as a water tower or pump station. But this identification doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The structure looks far too elaborate and delicate for a utilitarian water reservoir. More importantly, for the climate of the region, such a design would be disastrous. During winter, with below freezing temperatures, an exposed water system of this configuration would freeze solid, becoming completely non-functional. The technical impracticality of a water tower forces us to seek other explanations. Most likely, this was a modernized dome structure, whose shape was dictated not by aesthetics, but by physics. A dome crowned with a spire, in the context of alternative energy theories, functions as a concentrator or receiver of atmospheric vibrations. There's a compelling hypothesis that this structure somehow acted upon those vertical pillars arranged in rows on the roof of the building in front of it. If we view the architectural ensemble as a unified circuit, The dome tower could have fulfilled the role of a field generator or signal amplifier, broadcasting to the receiving elements on the roofs. This completely transforms our understanding of late 19th century architecture. What we dismiss as decorative excess, spires, domes, colonnades on rooftops, these could actually be components of a sophisticated wireless energy system. In this context, the relationships between various exhibition structures become clear. The Palace of Machines and neighboring pavilions were filled with equipment requiring power. Yet in photographs from that era, you don't see power lines in the volume that would be necessary for conventional electricity distribution. The energy arrived differently. The domed structure, interacting with atmospheric electricity, or what some called the etheric field, could broadcast potential to the pillar antennas installed on roofs and cornices. When this technology was recognized as dangerous or undesirable for widespread distribution, the need for such specific architectural forms disappeared. The demolition of the Palace of Machines and dismantling of the mysterious tower became the logical conclusion of the free energy era. The destruction looks like a cover-up. If these buildings had remained standing, engineers of future generations would inevitably ask questions about the purpose of those strange metal arrays on the roofs and their connection to detached towers. Demolition allowed the history of technology to be rewritten, leaving descendants only pretty pictures and stories about steam engines. The very concept that a building could be part of a machine was lost. Architecture ceased to be functional in an energy sense and became simply shelter from weather. We lost the understanding of how the form of a structure can influence energy flows in the environment. But the most intriguing discoveries await not outside, where large-scale destruction hid the primary evidence, but inside the exhibition pavilions themselves. If you carefully study archival photographs of the interior spaces, you'll notice something that makes absolutely no sense in conventional terms. Among heavy presses, locomotives, and industrial lathes, in the very center of mechanical engineering exhibitions, you'll find objects that look like religious structures. Miniature churches, temples, chapels, standing in the same rows as factory equipment. This proximity was clearly not random, and when you examine these structures closely, it becomes obvious their internal configuration had little to do with worship. Through the latticed walls and unglazed windows of these miniature churches, you can see complex mechanisms. Gears, coils, metal cores, transmission shafts. The form of a religious building serving as a casing for a technical device. This discovery forces a complete rethinking of what these structures actually were. If a machine stands inside a church, then the church itself is an integral part of the engineering solution. Logic dictates that any machine requires energy input. In the age of steam, that meant thermal energy from burning coal. But steam engines are bulky, dirty systems, requiring boilers, furnaces, pipes, exhaust systems. These units, disguised as religious structures, have nothing in common with steam technology. They lack chimneys, no furnaces. Their construction is elegant and lightweight. Therefore, they must have been converting energy of a completely different type. The domed shape, the presence of spires and high vertical elements, these confirm the hypothesis that natural electrical energy extracted directly from the atmosphere powered these devices. In this context, elements we perceive as religious symbols acquire purely utilitarian technical meaning. The dome ceases to be a symbolic heavenly vault and becomes a resonator or accumulator of static charge. Spires and crosses, often featuring complex fractal structures resembling spiral trees or multi-dimensional antennas, functioned as receivers of atmospheric electricity. These spiral trees, abundantly decorating the tops of exhibition structures, weren't decoration. They were crucial functional components, without which the mechanisms inside the buildings would remain inert. What art historians today interpret as canonical church architecture was, for past engineers, strict technical specification for creating energy reception circuits. The sheer number of these objects in old photographs is staggering. It creates the impression that you're not looking at scattered individual achievements, but at a demonstration of a unified global energy system whose principles were understood and accessible to the masters of that time. It turns out that barely a century ago, humanity possessed technology to obtain cheap, perhaps even free, electricity literally from the air. One might assume such sophistication was limited to Paris, the undisputed capital of engineering fashion. But the facts suggest otherwise. This technology wasn't a secret or a local French phenomenon. It was deployed worldwide, and the geographic distribution is stunning. Exactly the same principles, the same generator churches and atmospheric receivers, were openly demonstrated and successfully operated in places that today seem like distant periphery. Transport yourself thousands of kilometers east to the Russian Empire, to the city of Blagoveshchensk on the Amur River. In 1898, the Amur Primorye exhibition was held in this remote frontier city, and studying surviving evidence from this event reveals those same mysterious structures. Pavilions with complex spires resembling miniature churches or chapels, crowned with specific spiral-shaped elements that look like stylized trees. In the harsh climate of the Far East, in conditions far removed from European comfort, engineers wouldn't waste resources creating such elaborate decorations unless they served a functional purpose. A machine disguised as an architectural object implies conversion of external field energy into mechanical or electrical power. If in Paris you might attribute this to artistic whimsy, in Blagoveshchensk, where pragmatism dominated, the presence of such devices suggests that extracting energy from the atmosphere was routine technology available even in the provinces. But the true scale of Russian participation in this global energy network is revealed at the Nizhny Novgorod Fair. This famous commercial and industrial center was in no way inferior to the Paris Universal Expositions, in some aspects even surpassing them. It was a city within a city, the economic heart of the empire, where million-ruble deals were concluded and cutting-edge achievements demonstrated. The architectural ensemble of the Nizhny Novgorod Fair represented a highly complex system, saturated with the same elements as the Palace of the Champ de Mars. The main pavilions were covered with rows of vertical pillars and spires. These weren't merely roof decorations. These pillars contained the secret of autonomous lighting and power supply for the entire complex. There's a well-founded theory that inside these structures were capsules containing certain substances or gases which, under the influence of atmospheric fields, would begin to glow or initiate ionization processes necessary for operating gas discharge lamps. This explains why the night illumination of the Nizhny Novgorod Fair amazed contemporaries with its magnificence and brightness, while requiring none of the bulky infrastructure needed for traditional incandescent lighting. Today, nothing remains of this splendor. The fate of the Nizhny Novgorod Fair proved as tragic as that of the Parisian palaces. On the site of this grandiose complex that should have become a monument to world engineering, there was simply wasteland for decades. Even if modern builders decided to recreate the external appearance, it would be merely an empty shell, cargo cult architecture. You cannot recreate the true essence because the technology is lost. No one will build functioning generator churches anymore. No one will install operational accumulator pillars on roofs because the very knowledge of their operating principles exists under unspoken but strict prohibition. This decision wasn't made at the level of city planners. It was made at the global level of managing civilization's development. What was destroyed in Nizhny Novgorod isn't just brick and mortar. It's part of a unified worldwide system of free energy that was dismantled everywhere, systematically, as if following a coordinated plan. If we accept that the architectural forms of the past, those spires, domes, colonnades, and obelisks, were functional nodes of a global energy network rather than mere decoration, then we must ask about the nature of the force that powered the system. All evidence indicates that a century ago, humanity knew how to interact with atmospheric electricity at a level that seems fantastical today. This wasn't burning fuel to rotate turbines. This was direct extraction of potential from the environment. We can hypothesize that Earth's atmosphere itself possessed different physical and chemical properties then, was more saturated and conductive, allowing energy to be harvested literally from thin air using resonant circuits, the role of which was played by those temple complexes and exhibition pavilions. In this light, Nikola Tesla, whom official science portrays as a brilliant loner ahead of his time, acquires completely different meaning. Perhaps Tesla wasn't so much discovering unknown frontiers as serving as the last keeper of a dying era. A man allowed to openly demonstrate ancient, previously common technologies during their twilight period. His famous Wardenclyffe Tower strikingly resembles those structures that stood at industrial exhibitions in Paris, Chicago, and Nizhny Novgorod. Maybe Tesla was trying to adapt old principles of etheric energetics to new conditions. Or perhaps he was the only one permitted to demonstrate these capabilities while global powers decided the energy future of civilization. After Tesla's death, or rather at a certain historical moment in the early 20th century, a sharp paradigm shift occurred. Technologies allowing energy acquisition without wires and meters were thoroughly purged. There's a hypothesis this related to global changes in Earth's atmosphere, some natural cataclysm that weakened the etheric field, so old resonators ceased functioning. But the version of deliberate suppression looks more plausible and far more cynical. Wireless energy cannot be controlled. It cannot be sold by tariff. You cannot install a meter on it. For emerging transnational corporations and financial elites, such technology represented an existential threat. That's why the bet was placed on hydrocarbons and wired electrical transmission. This created consumer dependence on suppliers and allowed construction of hierarchical systems for managing resources and capital. Powerful forces decided to dismantle the old world, not just physically, by demolishing palaces and destroying equipment, but mentally. A massive machine for rewriting history and physics was activated. Knowledge about obtaining cheap energy was declared pseudoscience or heresy. Equipment was destroyed or hidden in closed vaults. We descendants were left with a truncated version of reality where electricity is obtained through hard labor and costs money. If you delve even further into history, examining engravings and paintings from the 16th through 18th centuries, you discover astonishing evidence that electric illumination wasn't invented in the late 19th century. The Kremlin, European castles, city streets, and ancient artwork are flooded with light, whose nature clearly has no relation to oil lamps or torches. This confirms that atmospheric electricity technologies existed for centuries, being commonplace for our ancestors. Tesla merely tried to modernize what was once normal before the era of the Great Prohibition. To be finally convinced that the global technological shift wasn't natural evolution but forced demolition, you need only examine documentary evidence from the period after 1920. The contrast between eras before and after is striking, creating a sensation of deep, systemic degradation. Look at archival materials from Parisian exhibition halls in 1923. A completely different world appears. The sensation of lightness and etheric saturation has vanished. In place of majestic temples of science and mysterious resonant structures came utilitarian heavy ordinariness that became our reality for the next century. The first thing you notice is the change in lighting character. Instead of flooding, shadowless radiance whose nature was embedded in architectural forms, you see dismal strings of incandescent bulbs suspended on crude wires. This web of cables became the symbol of the new era, the era of control and metering. Light ceased to be a property of space activated by domes and spires. It became a commodity delivered in measured doses through wires. The architecture underwent fundamental changes, becoming a form of cargo cult. Pillars and columns that were previously functional elements of the energy system remained in building designs but lost their essence. In structures, from the 1920s, they exist purely as decoration. Detailed examination reveals no working substances attached to their bases, no waveguides connected, complex finials absent, just stone and plaster mimicking the shape of ancient devices, but completely devoid of content. Architects of the new era continued copying external features without understanding why these elements were originally necessary beyond aesthetics. The exhibition spaces themselves, once filled with living machines and miniature generator churches, were emptied. Those mysterious units housing fuel-free mechanisms vanished without trace. Their places were taken by internal combustion engines and primitive electric motors tied to outlets. Technological diversity was standardized and reduced to formats convenient for industrial production and monetization. The very atmosphere of mystery and infinite possibility that characterized the 1900 exhibitions was dissolved. Pavilions that still remained were living out final days before demolition. The cleanup process was total. All buildings forming the unified resonant network, from Parisian palaces to Nizhny Novgorod complexes, were condemned to destruction. They were demolished with remarkable haste, leaving nothing behind, as if authorities feared someone might decipher the secret of their operation. This wasn't urban renewal. This was erasure of memory. Not just walls were destroyed, but material proof of an alternative branch of civilization's development. We were left with hollowed-out history, where progress moves linearly from torch to light bulb, where where there's no room for technologies capable of making humanity free from resource dependence. We live in a world built on ruins of a more developed culture we don't even remember. The old world was dismantled, its technologies declared impossible, its achievements attributed to science fiction. Yet despite all efforts to censor the past, some artifacts slip through the veil of forgetting, stumping researchers who encounter them. In concluding this investigation, I want to draw attention to one unique document accidentally preserved among sordid archives. An old photograph from one of these exhibitions captures a device whose design defies classification from the standpoint of modern engineering. It's a complex apparatus lacking the usual pistons, furnaces, or electrical windings, yet clearly performing an important function. Its shape, combining crystalline geometry with rotational mechanics, hints at operating principles we've completely lost today. Looking at this object, you can only ask a question that perhaps no one remains to answer. Do you know what this is? Or have we sunk so deep into imposed illusion that we've finally forgotten our real past, ceasing to recognize the tools our great-grandparents possessed? This silent witness from a bygone era serves as a reminder of how much was lost and how little we truly know about the real history of technical progress. The exhibitions of the 19th century weren't just trade shows. They were demonstrations of a global energy infrastructure that operated on principles fundamentally different from what we use today. And the systematic destruction of that infrastructure, the demolition of those buildings, the suppression of that knowledge, this wasn't accident or natural obsolescence. It was deliberate policy. Someone decided that humanity would not be allowed to continue using free atmospheric energy. Someone determined we would become dependent on metered, monetized power sources instead. And that decision, made barely a century ago, shapes the world we inhabit today, a world where we pay for every kilowatt, while photographs from our grandparents' era show cities lit without visible power sources, machines operating without fuel, buildings that were themselves components of an energy grid we've been trained not to see. The question isn't whether this technology existed. The photographic evidence is overwhelming once you know what to look for. The question is why we were forced to forget, and who benefits from our continued ignorance.